All right, this is the third recording that I'm doing this week, and this one is on your midterm. All right, it's going to be a kind of a brief overview. All right, um, first I'm going to show you where it is. So I'm over here on our homepage. I'm going to go to lessons, click on that, and it's kind of in order. If you come down to about halfway down, week 4 is about when all this is due. There's the midterm exam folder. If I go back up and I look at the schedule, note that we have week 4 midterms due that week. That um, basically, when you come down to the bottom, though, midterms presentations due on the 20th. Written document submission is due on the 27th. All right, now what does that mean? Well, instead of a regular exam, what you're going to have is as you probably guessed, a presentation. This is going to be partly research-based, but it's also designed to test what you learned during the course of the first half of the class. All right. Usually we do this face-to-face, so it works a little better and then. But basically what you have to do is go out, find a recipe from the ancient world and recreate it and do a presentation on it. You um, don't have to prepare the food since we are not going to meet face to face. Usually we do that, and most people actually enjoy that midterm and that experience. Uh, if you want to make the food, of course, you are perfectly welcome to do that. All right. When I go in the folder, I'm gonna see that I got some guidelines. Again, you have to, do a presentation. This opens up as a Word document, so I've got to go um, change screens here for you. You see the guidelines are pretty short. That should be showing on your screen right about now. I'm going to try to make that a little bigger for you. Unfortunately, the bar, um, there we go, is covering. All right, there we go. Our world history, this is specific to you up to 1500. We're in the midterm, so we're not that far up yet. We're not going to be looking at the Middle Ages. We basically end about the halfway point with the ancient world, and the second half is going to be the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. All right. Uh, this is going to be research based. Please do not go up and just turn in a recipe, say I found it, I cooked it, and list the ingredients. That will basically get you a 20 on this. I give 20 points for doing the presentation. That's all you'll get because the 80% that's the real grade is coming off of your research and the history that you put into this. And there should be a lot of it. Also, you should have some stuff in there that indicates that you have read and recognize how that relates to the materials in the textbook. All right. Now, the directions basically for our class, you want to go back to the original 4 old world civilizations, and they're in the parentheses if you forgot them: Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, or China, and recreate a dish from that recipe. You do have a date limitation on that. You should pick a recipe that is older than 300 BCE. If it's from 1000 AD, or if it's from the Roman Empire, that's when it first appears, avoid it. You want one that is older. All right. Now, a few things on here. We're not really cooking, so some of this doesn't apply to you. If you were cooking, you can substitute ingredients. Sometimes the ones from the ancient world are now that were cheap are now very expensive, or you just can't get them. Sometimes we don't know what they were, so we're making a guess. All right. If there is an ingredient in the original records leave you in doubt as to what it is, they reference a spice, and you might be mace, might be cloves, and it's unclear in the sources that you find. then you should say that. Don't say, well, it's mace. All right. No, your job is not to go in there and make a decision on what it is unless you've done tons of research and are a professional in the field. Your goal is to do research to tell me what the history is. And if the history says this might be one of three ingredients, you say there's three ingredients. It could be any one of those, and that's what the sources say. That's what research is. You're going out and finding what knowledge is available. All right. Prepare any type of presentation you want. A PowerPoint is fine. Google Docs, you should be careful of. I think Apple might use something. I know they use Pages for one of their word processors. They might use something like that. Keep in mind that I got to be able to open it on the other end. And if it's one of those things I can't open, I can't really give you points for it. You are going to do two things. Again, you do have the option of coming in and doing the presentation live if you want to. Last couple of semesters when we did these for online classes, nobody wanted to. So I'm assuming what you're going to do is a presentation that you will record, and you can get that to me a number of ways. Usually the file is going to be too big to email or to upload in Blackboard. So in the syllabus, it says, if you submit an assignment and it's a cloud link, Drive, Google Drive, anything like you just put a link in there, it's going to be a 0. That is true for the presentation itself. But you can do that for the video because I don't grade the video. All right, you do it, you get the 20 points. The video is to verify that you're doing the work, and that's for our proctoring. And that's all. So you can give me the link to the video, the PowerPoint or whatever, upload the file. The reason I can't take a link is because those links, you got a due date. Maybe it takes me a week to get to grade those to yours. You could be going back in and altering that file for the entire week. So it gives you something of an unfair advantage. Not that you would necessarily do that as an individual, but I got to basically consider the entire class and what's fair to the rest of the people in there as well. All right. You can also do this if you don't want to do PowerPoint. You can just type up the presentation in Word, whatever. But keep in mind, you're going to do the presentation. You'll have some information in it. It should be brief. I don't need it to be long. I just need it to be basically an outline of what you do. You want to have as much detail as possible in the written part that you submit, though. So if you do a PowerPoint, submit that PowerPoint. That might have 5 times as much information as what you actually covered in your voice or video recording of your actual presentation. The document is what I will use to do the actual grading. I will go through the video if you mentioned something and it's obvious you somehow left it out of the PowerPoint. I'll consider that and give you points for it. But make sure that you put the detail in the writing. Shoot for maybe 5 to 10 minutes max on your presentation. You skip a lot of that stuff because I don't need you to say everything. I can read it. All right. There is a rubric. We're about to go over that next. Your cooking ability, we won't be doing it, so it's not graded, obviously. If you were, I don't grade on that as long as you don't poison me or something. Make sure you cite all the sources. I don't, strictly speaking, require you to do the Chicago Manual reference style on this, but make sure that at a minimum I know who wrote the source, what the title of the source is, and where I can find it. If you go to Galileo and you go to JSTOR, you will be able to find some of these recipes, and those are the best places. If you go do a web search, you can find some good stuff, but you will also find that some of it kills your grade. I had a student who did Mesopotamian tabbouleh salad. Includes bulgur wheat, parsley, onions, spring onions, mint. All those things were available, and that would be legitimate. But they also mentioned that it has tomatoes in it, which the dish itself does not date back to pre-300, and you can tell that because tomatoes come from the New World and were not available over there until after Columbus. So, you know, use your common sense and think about things. Number one, a lot of the stuff when you read, it's gonna remind you of stuff. Oh, this sounds like something might be related to something in the textbook. A lot of this stuff in the textbook, they're not going to say anything about it in your recipe. You've got to put 2 and 2 together and get 4. Oh, they're talking about this in the culture. I read this in the culture section on ancient Egypt. That seems like it just makes sense that this is related and you need to describe that. All right. All right. Now we're going to go back and I'm going to look at Chrome here again. All right. Presentation guidelines. I'm going to back up out of that. There's my submission. Wow, this looks completely different than it used to. Interesting. All right. I might have to go back and see. It looks like the Blackboard's done some changes, some updates while we were out there. But basically go in there and upload files. Make sure you upload a file. If you go over here on the right, it's still there. There is a rubric. I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can make sure that the rubric is actually showing. There we go. All right, again, the first one is you do the presentation. You don't have to cook this time since we're not live, but you get up and do your presentation, you get 20 points. You don't do it, you get a 0. Keep in mind, this is the proctoring requirement, so if you don't do the presentation, you get a 0 for the whole thing. I can't give you credit for the other 80 points if I can't satisfy the proctoring requirement and say that you actually are the one who did the work. All right. Now, after that, you'll see all the other ones have stuff in the A, B, C, D column. All right. Let's just go through and basically look at what you want to do in your research. Number one, if you look at the F range, we'll just go ahead and knock that out. Basically, if you don't address it, that's a 0. You can still get an F in there if it is, just very vague, you don't do much, or you put some information in there that's incorrect. Remember, I said if you use the wrong recipe, you go to a web page and it talks about some recipe. It might even be a dish that's been around in some form for 4,000 years, all right, prehistory maybe. But the fact that you're using a recipe that's from now that includes ingredients they just did not have, probably going to put you down in that F range in at least some of these categories. So keep that in mind and go as much as possible to academic sources. You'll find some good books in Galileo that are on the history of food, and it will help you a lot with some of this. All right. Now, first thing there, after you do the presentation, you're going to address the culture. Food is always a big part of everybody's culture. You think of the South here in the United States. Yeah, most of the classes I say, think of a food that's Southern. Fried chicken. When do you eat fried chicken? Well, Fridays, right? I mean, sorry, Saturdays, Sundays, right after church. All right. It used to be Friday night was fish night. All right. Religious reasons, but religion is part of culture. So some of this is going to just be, because we have so many pigs in the South in the 1800s. That's what small, poor farmers had. They made barbecue. That's a Southern dish, and that's something that you talk about Southern culture comes to mind right off the bat. Same thing with fried chicken, basically cheap and easy to cook. You think of the fish, that actually ties in with the religion. So then you talk about, well, why do they have fish on Fridays? What's that got to do with religion? Well, you look into it, you'll find that, hey, that can actually be traced back to the Middle Ages when the church, required you to actually fast from Friday up until you broke the fast on Sunday. Well, what's that got to do with fish? Well, the Pope issued an edict that you can't have meat when you're fasting at all. All right, general fast, you don't eat during the day, you can eat at night. All right, sun up to sundown basically is the rule. But what you also had prohibitions on what you can eat at night, so no meat. But the Pope said the fish is not a meat, so everybody ate fish. Now, you have the Protestant Reformation. We break away from most of Catholic traditions. But somehow over here, they keep eating fish and honoring that as part of the Sabbath, even if they don't observe anything else to do with the fasting as you go into the Sabbath. They might eat every meal on Friday and Saturday, but they're still eating fish on Friday night. And that kind of stays around all the way up until really about my generation. Y'all's, I don't find too many kids in my classes now who are coming up now, or even the millennials who, knew that or familiar with that at all. All right, but keep in mind, if you look at these categories, it even says that you can talk about things. We're talking about ancient world, so usually the food might have a relationship with mythology. A lot of times, if it's an important crop like rice in China, there might even be a god or goddess of rice, god or goddess of, you know, agriculture in general, but rice is heavily a part of that. All right. Over in Europe, it might be the Middle East, it might be wheat, might be barley. If you do something with barley, might also have some relationship to beer. Um, you can also see a lot of cultural functions, celebrations. Some of that could tie back to religion. So you might talk about religion and use and cultural functions at the same time. Think Thanksgiving, for example. In American culture, turkey, you know, mashed potatoes, all the whole thing, the whole meal together, associated, all those things associated with um, Thanksgiving. Many people now don't realize that that is a religious holiday. All right, so what's the purpose of it? You give thanks. Well, who were you giving thanks to when they first issued this? It was the Pilgrims, as we trace back to one. You can actually go back. The first Thanksgiving on what's now the U.S. was actually Hernando de Soto. They used to just not have a special day. They just called a Thanksgiving whenever something big happened and they wanted to give thanks. They gave thanks to God. That's what the Pilgrims did. That's what Abraham Lincoln did when he called for it in the Civil War. So it has a religious nexus, and then those foods are associated with it. Now it's just a standard holiday. Some people may or may not include the religious function. Same thing with Christmas. A lot of people eat specific foods on Christmas or Easter. All those are religious holidays. Again, ancient world, so you might be looking at different holidays depending on which culture you pick. But lots of foods have um, specific times you eat them. Like most people don't even eat a full roasted turkey except on Thanksgiving, and some people do it on Christmas too. All right. Um, Now, if you look down at the D range, you got some errors and stuff like that. You can still be in the D range. You look at the C, you've got basic information about the role in society. The B and the A range is where you want to be. And this is kind of true for everything all the way down to the bottom. All right. The more detail you put in, the higher your grade goes up. The more detail includes things like dates. I want you to draw me a map, a timeline of this dish. So you look at this like significant information about the cultural significance of the dish. You might find that, for example, wedding cakes were not a thing in the Middle Ages if we were doing modern society. Maybe they just started doing a cake at a wedding, maybe in the 1700s, and then somewhere in the 1800s, the person got the idea of making that the centerpiece and putting the little doll, the bride and groom, and all that stuff. And now it's impossible to have a real wedding, and people are going to think you're crazy if you don't have a wedding cake, not just a cake, but a specific wedding cake. And you can see an evolution. Well, the first cake was used in a wedding in 1756. The first time they actually called it a wedding cake and made this a centerpiece with decorations and all the stuff was 1832, and so on and so on and so on. Put dates in there. All right, you might find that we did not use turkey in the first Thanksgiving. It was mostly seafood. So when did turkey become the dish, the center of the Thanksgiving dinner? What year? All right, you're going to draw me a map of all that kind of stuff. If it's the ancient world, it might be ranges. You're not going to have necessarily a year. So you're not going to say 2257 BC is when they first started taking rice and making it into whatever dish you're doing. What you're going to do is find something where they say, rice, they started putting it into this dish that's served at weddings in somewhere between 2000 and 2500 BC, or maybe it's a decade, century, but you'll have a range because we just do not have written records, and we're kind of looking at the archaeological evidence a lot of times, or when it's popping up in writing that this is a thing. So you're not going to have an exact date. Again, don't put one in there if there is not one. Put in accuracy. The accurate thing is not to say 1157 BCE. The accurate thing to say is scholars say that this could have started being used in religious functions in 1100 BCE, and some say it might not have been introduced until 1075 BCE. All right, that's accurate. All right, picking a date out of your hat is not accurate. Saying what the scholarship says is accurate, so keep that in mind. The more dates you put in there that show me how things change over time, the better your grade is going to be. And note the last part of the B range to get to the A and B range, all relevant information from the textbook and aside readings that is related to this goes into this presentation. Again, some of this, the sources you have aren't going to say that. You have to put two and two together. Oh, I know, such and such is what they did in the religious functions. I find that this is being used in temples in Mesopotamia. Put that together with what you get in the textbook, and you're basically using critical thinking skills. That's what we're looking for at the college level, that you can think and use logic and draw conclusions that are rational. All right, not that you can memorize a bunch of facts and just regurgitate them. All right. All right, the second one, basically all those rules apply. So I'm just going to more or less go over a few little things on here. The more detail, the dates, all that stuff, things that you want to include in all that, the more detail, the better the grade. Notice the second category is socioeconomic and class structure. All right, both wealth and class. Keep in mind, you could be a noble and be poor. You could be a peasant and be rich. The class does not always correlate to your economic circumstances. This, for several semesters, was the one that got ignored most. People would say, oh, this is a rich person's dish, and it was rich people's because it had, a lot of people always do tiger nut sweets because it had honey in it, which was cheap. I mean, was expensive, and it had, dates in it, which only rich people had. You got to go into more detail than that to get score well in this. So what you want to look for here, number one, is why this might be important to, say, poor people, right? Yes, if you look at it on the surface, all you can say, one person did lentil stew, for example. This is poor people's because lentils are cheap, right? That is fine, but they went through a further analysis. Why was this important to poor people? Well, when you look at it, one thing that you see, go a little bit further into that, is that poor people very rarely had meat, and what they had to find was a good substitute in terms of getting their protein. It did analysis how lentils, particularly when combined in a dish with rice, actually provide all the amino acids that your body can use to make human proteins that we use. So you had a nice discussion of the science behind that, the nutritional value, and how that related. They also had basically beans of all types are basically protein and carbohydrates, and that's about it. So mentioned the same thing, how this was also a high energy dish, and talked about how, the average worker back then without machinery was probably burning somewhere 6,000 to 12,000 calories a day, and this would be a food that could sustain that. So you look for things that you can put in more. Now, when you look at rich people's dishes, a lot of times there's going to be one thing in there, or maybe just a couple things that make it a rich person's dish. Don't stop with that. There might be some dishes that are rich people's, but then poor people do eat it, just not frequently, or middle class people eat it not as frequently. So you want to discuss that. That's actually going to link your categories together. So, this, take modern context, this lobster is something that is a rich person's dish. Nobody goes out and eats lobster even once a week that I know, because nobody has that kind of money. But what you can say is, but this is something that, poor people might actually partake in. It's going to be for special events. You might have, for example, a low country boil, or that includes lobster in certain regions of the country. You might even talk about how this was a rich person's dish, but over here in America, the lobster is expensive. However, if you go down to Cajun country, they have substituted crawdads, which are even called, poor people's lobster. And you can see that there's a variation on it for poor people using different ingredients. Go deeper into this category, get your points there. All right. Cooking and serving practices. Now note that this is going to have a lot of cultural stuff in it and maybe some socioeconomics. Note that the other two categories are about your dish. This a lot of times is about the technology, right? What kind of oven did they have? If you have ever eaten Indian food in a restaurant, they'll have a tandoori chicken or tandoori whatever. That is actually, tandoor is a type of oven. So what did they cook in? If it's Chinese food, did they, traditionally think of it as being a wok, but what was the wok made of when it was first invented? How did they get chopsticks when they ate it? What were the cultural practices of serving food? Example I use here that shows a lot, because China is very rigid in its system of Confucian hierarchy where everybody has an exact rank. The United States is very egalitarian, so even some things that look similar, you're going to look for the differences. Example I use is, if you look even like in the 50s in the South, you get a big, family reunion or whatever. Who eats first? Well, typically the men are served first, then the kids, then the women. All right. Looks like it's a patriarchal, male-dominated society since they get to eat first. And you would, through history, probably be very much correct on that. If you look at China, it looks like the same. Well, who eats first? It's going to be the men. Well, it looks the same. But no, it's not. It's Confucian. It's hierarchical. Who eats first? The oldest man, the head of the family. Then the next oldest man is served. It is actually in order. In the South, everybody was more equal, at least among those groups. So all the men sat down and just dug in and started eating because they were equal. There was no rank above them. But in China, you serve to reinforce the rank. Oldest man first, usually patriarch. Then the next oldest, all the way down. Then you start with the women, oldest down to the youngest. So it looks the same. It is still male dominated, but there is some very distinct differences there. So go into those. Confucius didn't just go all the way back to the beginning of Chinese society. So you would want to talk about how that might have been brought in before Confucius, maybe, and he was just reiterating it or reinforcing it, or maybe he developed that idea, or maybe he put the idea out there and people didn't start doing it till 100 years after he's dead, and his stuff, again, put those dates in, put the stuff from the textbook in, and get all that stuff that you can, as much detail as possible. All right, last one. I know somebody was wanting to do the research paper on the Silk Road. This one actually gets into some of that. You want to look at the origin of ingredients. You want to, some of these you want to talk about, say, rice cultivation, for example, starts in southern China, and you want to put a date in there, and it's probably going to be prehistoric. Same thing for wheat. Most of these early crops, barley, you're going to make basically saying something about how it started in the Neolithic era when they first started farming or whatever, which is fine. Other ingredients you're going to see appearing, like peaches, don't appear in China. If it's in an Egyptian dish, I don't think you'll find one, but what you'll see is that peach had to get from China to Egypt, and what you're going to be exploring is how goods were moving via trade. You've read about the Silk Road. You've read about how, trade was linking China all the way to Rome by the time of the two empires. So what you want to look at is, again, don't just say, oh, this came from China and got over to Egypt. What you want to do is say, give me an idea of how extensive these trade networks were and how old they are. So black pepper is a good one. It comes from India. You'll find it in a few Egyptian dishes. You can look and you will see it's introduced. I'm making updates, by the way, so you'll have to find these for real. But this dish had black pepper, and we can see black pepper was introduced. It originates in India, where from there it was transferred to Mesopotamia, and the Mesopotamians, maybe had it around 2000 BCE, and then you can see that the trade network with Egypt was pretty extensive, 500 years later, we start seeing it appearing in, Egypt. So that is basically not just telling me, you know, that there's a trade network in the ancient world, but that goes from India all the way eventually to Egypt. But you're telling me how it spread. It was in this area, a little further and further west each decade, century, or whatever. Get those dates in there. That stuff is what gets you points, right? Detail. Also make, you got stuff in the textbook that talk about trade in general. So if you can see the trade routes developing in the book, it might be talking about silk moving, right? But if you're looking at that, you can say, well, this is the way silk moves, so I'm sure that these spices went along the same route. All right. So again, put effort in that. You actually are, again, recording, so I do not expect any kind of actual cooking unless you just want to do it for yourself, and put the research into it. Be as thorough as possible, hit all the categories, make sure you do the recording because I can't give you credit for the entire thing, any of it, unless you do the recording. Recent times, the cooking and service, I kind of reinforced that people had been missing the socioeconomics, so they started doing a better job on that. And then they started skimping on information on cooking and serving practices. Make sure you do all of it. The idea is if you go and hit the one people have been skipping, but then you skip another one, it basically gets you the same result. So, try to make sure that you do as thorough as possible on all of this. My advice is sometimes what you'll find is like you won't find necessarily that, let's say you do fried rice, you might not find any special way that fried rice in itself was served. So go in and talk about how the culture food was generally served. So it might be fried rice, it might be any dish that's, you go in and serve it the same way. That Confucian model that I used it as an example does not necessarily relate to any one dish. That's going to be just in general. So if you can't find something specific to a dish, find something that's how did they just serve food normally and put it into detail. Sometimes, by the way, you will find that a dish was served a particular way because there's something special about it. And again, that's where you start tying these together. Maybe it's served special because it's tied to the Chinese New Year, and you got some religious things in there, some other cultural things in there. So you're tying all those categories together. That's a good thing. That gets you more points. It kind of shows that you're holistic in your thinking and you're putting things together, not just looking up this, and not drawing threads between them and understanding what you're looking at. So that's actually going to be good for you. Now, go to Galileo, look for books. Go to JSTOR might have something. I've never actually looked on JSTOR, so I don't know. That midterm overview is right there. I'm going to go to our, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that one because that's WebEx. I might break this. Let me go to Lanier, our website, and I'm going to go back to the Galileo link just to show you students, library, Galileo. Right. I'm just going to do a quick look for history of food. I'm going to come down. Food and world history, that's actually might be perfect right there. I'm going to click on that. And I think y'all can see this when it finally loads. You get a abstract there. I'm going to look at the table of contents. Columbian Exchange, that's going to be more modern, picks up around the end of our course. So this might not be as useful as you would think. Might be, again, just a little bit too modern for us. So I'm going to go back and look down. And we see nothing that really looks good. If I went and searched and clicked and expanded out, I might find something. look specific for Mesopotamian food. Maybe I get something, maybe I don't. Amazing multi-million year history of processed food. That might actually be helpful there. Priestess, poet, politician. Inudwana is the first known author who composed Sumerian songs and hymns. It might actually have some stuff in there. I would say you might be better off, if you're able to type, unlike me today, but looking for those specific peoples within. I don't know why they get Babylonian on the origin of spices. It looks like it's going to be beneficial. Some of these are easier than others. Egyptian is probably going to be a little easier to find. You might have to use some, history of Egyptian covenant Jews in there. That's going to be too recent. Tales of the Unexpected Since the Days of Tutankhamun. It's probably more on the, I guess I should put food on there. That would probably help. Oh, I went too far. Yeah, you see some stuff actually in some of those, that's Roman Egypt, by the way, so that's going to be too recent. You can still look at it because, again, a lot of recipes are actually date back for thousands of years before that. But you see diet footprint of the Egyptian mongoose, unless you want to, I guess you could do that since we're not cooking. I don't think you're going to find mongoose at the store, though. Where'd the books go? There we go. It gets you more in the Middle Ages, but you'll see some stuff in here. Documents in the history of Egyptian feminism is probably more recent. But this one, the afterlives of Egyptian history, believe it or not, you might actually find very, very useful. This one, Food History Culminac, I know that one's actually going to be useful to you. I've looked that one up before. Culinary History, that's going to be somewhat useful to you. The thing about the tombs, actually, a lot of the recipes that we have from that period are actually on tomb walls. So we actually, that actually can be useful to you, believe it or not. And sometimes not sometimes, almost all the times, pharaohs and other people were buried with food or whatever that they liked and wanted to carry with them to the afterworld. Beer was common in there. Another thing I should mention is usually we have to say that we can't make beer and stuff. I had some people who wanted to make Egyptian beer or Mesopotamian beer and bring it when we sample it, but we can't do that because we do not have we have a policy that does not allow us to serve alcohol or consume alcohol. Plus, even if we did, I wouldn't do it because there's too much legal liability on us in case somebody goes out and gets a DUI and blames it on their midterm exam. But since you are staying home, I guess you could do that for this presentation since you do not have to cook it or anything like that. There are some people who've actually done a lot of research on Mesopotamian beer. The problem that you might have, and this is the last thing I'll mention, is that what you want is a dish that has more than just a few ingredients. You want to demonstrate capacity to do research adequately, especially when that origin of ingredients category. So you want something like 6 to 8 ingredients. You don't want something with 20 because you are expected to do all that research and that takes up too much time. But the same thing, you don't want to do something like, hey, my topic is bread. My ingredients were water, flour, and salt. Only one of those is an agricultural product, and basically you don't have any research to actually show anything. So shoot for something that's got more than just a couple of ingredients, but something that's not got too many. I've had some people go up to about 10 ingredients and do that well. Keep in mind, some of these things you don't have to talk about, like the geological history of salt, like this salt vein salt formed like 3 billion years ago when, rocks were solidifying and what, blah, blah, blah. But what you might talk about is how the Egyptians got salt. Where did they mine it? Did they dehydrate seawater? And each culture might have a different way of doing that. Obviously, if they're mining it, the locations are different. But frequently you'll see that there's a combination of mining it when it's in the ground, as well as getting it from dehydrating seawater. Sea salt is very popular. That's how we basically get it. We dehydrate it, or what happens a lot of times is you got the high tide come in on rocky areas. When it recedes, basically the salt is left there as the water dries, and people come in and scrape it off. So that's another way of getting it. So you can look at that. Water is everywhere. Don't give me the history of water per se. But you might want to look at, hey, how did the Egyptians get water and make sure that it was clean, or the Mesopotamians, or whomever? Because that could be something important and something that actually is part of history. And I know in Mesopotamia, for example, one of the problems you have is that you irrigate because it's dry off of the rivers, and when you irrigate it, it's fresh water, but even fresh water has little trace amounts of salt. So over 1,000 years, what happens is you accumulate too much salt on the ground to actually grow stuff, and that has an impact on things. So you might look at some of those type of issues. I don't need like geological histories, water formed, X billion years ago and all that stuff, because that's not history. That's more in the science realm. But you can talk about how the Egyptians, made sure that they got water that was clean, fresh, and safe to use, or salt. But that's where I'm going to wrap it up. And again, if you run into any trouble, send me an email. Keep in mind, I'm on WebEx. This is the app that we are now using for the video conferencing and classes and stuff. If you've got the time and our schedules are compatible, I can do a meeting with you over here too, and we can go through some things. And sometimes it's easier if you're having trouble finding sources, if I can go through and do searches that might help you specifically. So those meetings can be pretty valuable, but let me know if you need that kind of help. All right, that's it, and good luck on this. Usually these turn out very well. This class has been pretty good so far, so I'm expecting that to actually come out pretty good. Just remember to be thorough, and good luck with it. Bye-bye.